Morning, everybody. I hope you're safe and warm wherever you are. Um, this podcast, or it's going to be a couple of podcasts, and the assignment that I give today, that I send out later today, is designed to show you what I think is a terrific example of historical technique. Specifically, how a historian threads evidence into a narrative. And the historian in question is a guy named Charles Dew. I could have picked a bunch of historians, but I just think this is his book, which is a short book, and you're only reading a chapter of it anyway. His book is written for a general audience. He's really grappling with the question of what was the cause of the Civil War. To this day, there are a lot of white people, I've never heard an African American say this, that claim that the Civil War, what started the Civil War, was states' rights, not slavery or the fear of emancipation. Fine. That's ridiculous, of course, but that's really not even the point of this assignment. I think he demonstrates very clearly that Southern states left the Union in 1860-61 because they were terrified of emancipation and the consequences of emancipation. But that's not super important either. Why I want you to look at this book is it's a very well written book, and it offers wonderful examples of threading evidence, mostly primary, into a narrative in a way that supports an argument. Okay? So that's what you're looking for in this book. You're looking for technique. And this is just a wonderful example of a very experienced historian who uses the technique of weaving evidence into a narrative in such a way that he supports his argument. Why am I doing this? Because this is what you will be doing in your papers. This is what historians do all the time. They gather evidence, both primary and secondary, and that's actually really the fun part. And then what they do is they decide on what the argument that they want to make about that evidence is. And then they try to write a convincing paper where they talk about their argument up front. This is what I'm going to demonstrate. This is what this paper will show. This is my argument. And then 20 pages or so of creating historical narrative in which you guys will be weaving evidence into a narrative in such a way that it supports the argument that you make in your paper. Now, don't get all fussed about historical argument right now. We're not even there yet. Let me just say you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. You don't have to come up with something new. I just want a very well-written paper. But let's just compartmentalize argument and not talk about it for now. What we're talking about now is just basic technique. And so that's why I'm having you look at this chapter from Charles Dew. And that's what I want you to get out of it, just his basic historical technique, because you'll be doing much the similar thing in your papers. Now, in order for Dew to make sense, I have to give a background to what he's talking about, and then I have to talk about what his argument is. You're not going to read chapters on that. Michael and I have chosen one chapter. We're not having you read the book. This isn't really about his argument, but to do the assignment well, you need to know what his argument is. And so that's what these podcasts are all about that I'm going to give today. So it contextualizes Charles Dew and what his aim was in this book in such a way that it'll make the chapter you read make more sense. But again, this is really, you're not arguing with Dew, you're not arguing for him, you're not arguing against him, at least in this part of the assignment. I just want you to see how he manipulates his evidence to create a highly readable narrative. Okay, so this part of the course, or this assignment, is about historical technique, making you aware of historical technique and giving you an example of what I think is an outstanding and quite readable historical narrative that is used to buttress an argument. Okay, so that's where we're coming from. First thing I have to talk about to contextualize due. Some of y'all might have taken a Civil War course from me at some point or not, but it doesn't matter. But here's the thing. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, November of 1860, Southern whites freaked out. They were positive that Lincoln was going to come in and emancipate the slaves. This is completely factually incorrect. You can look at Lincoln's inaugural. What Lincoln wanted to do was he wanted to contain slavery where it existed. He didn't want it to expand another inch into the U.S., especially in the western part of the U.S., which were just becoming states. Places like Kansas and the Dakotas and Minnesota, those areas of the country. And he felt like by containing slavery where it existed, it would die over time. So this is the thinking about Lincoln now. He was an abolitionist, but he was an abolitionist that was willing to allow slavery to last for generations. He wanted to kill it slowly. So in one respect, Southerners were right. Lincoln was anti-slavery, but he was willing to let slavery exist, like I said before, for generations. It could still exist today in some form or fashion. He just didn't want it to expand outside the states where it already existed. This was his game plan. So he's what we would call a gradualist. Well, Southern whites didn't see the subtleties or the complexities of Lincoln's stance. They just lumped him in with the more radical abolitionists who wanted slavery to end yesterday. And so there is this mass hysteria when Lincoln is elected president in the white South. Also, Lincoln is the first anti-slavery president ever elected to the executive branch. And this is getting a little bit too much into the weeds, and I'll just move past it quickly. When Lincoln's elected, he doesn't get any electoral votes from the South, and the South knows the South had a hammerlock on the presidency until 1860 for various reasons that I won't go into. But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency without getting one electoral vote from Southern states, and Southerners realize that they've lost the executive branch of the U.S. government, which means eventually they'll lose the Supreme Court, of course, because it's the president that appoints Supreme Court justices. And then the South still has a voice in Congress, but it's lost a lot of power because it's lost the presidency. Okay. So the South leaves the Union in two basic waves. The first wave is the lower South, and I've got a map here if you're at a screen. South Carolina is out of the Union by December of 1860. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas is out by February 1861. So the bottom tier, by the way, these were the parts of the South that had the highest proportion of slaves. Texas had 33% slaves, but Alabama and Mississippi, it was almost 50-50 slave to white. So the slaves that had the states that had the highest proportion of slaves left the Union first. The upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, although it stayed in the Union, they waited to see what Lincoln would do. So they don't leave the Union until April 1861 after the firing on Fort Sumter, which I'm not going to go into. Okay, so this is the context in which Due is talking about. So the thing that I want to get in your head before I go into the new podcast is the South leaves the Union in two ways. The lower South first, but then the upper South, including Kentucky, which Lincoln manages to keep in the Union, they're hesitating to leave the Union. And this is where Due's research comes in, and I'll talk about it in the next podcast.